our position is that we need to oppose counter-terror legislation, or what we like to call as terrorism legislation. And some consider this to be quite a extreme position, but I will explain to you why this is not an extreme position and why this position is a position we as people in democratic societies have to take. Now, if you look at the Prevention of Terrorism Act, if you listen to what Amiza was saying as well as Vasanta was saying, before anyone gets arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or before the government starts using the Prevention of Terrorism Act, what the government does it creates an ideology as to who a terrorist is. So for 30 years, because of the war in the north and east, the terrorist was Tamil. So the government created this idea among society that terrorists are Tamils. So when Tamils got arrested, in thousands, innocent people got arrested, people who were not part of the LTT, when they got arrested, large sections of our society did not speak about it. When they got tortured, when they were forced to confess, as Vasanta was saying, when they were charged with false accusations, no one spoke about it because in our heads, they were already terrorists. But the most recent example I can think of is the Easter Sunday attacks. And soon after the Easter Sunday attacks, I think the reason I take this example, it's fresh in our minds. So soon after the Easter Sunday attack, you remember, the government within 1 week framed the entire Muslim community as responsible for the Easter Sunday attack. So 8 people detonated themselves, of course from the Muslim community, but somehow the government framed the entire Muslim community as responsible for this Easter Sunday attack. And then you remember, within a period of 2 weeks, over 2,000 Muslims were arrested, and with the support of many of us. How many of us spoke against the arrest of 2,000 Muslims? So if you see the media at that time, if you see the media in April 2009, we would see videos of police going and raiding Muslim mosques, somehow getting swords from nowhere, and portraying this image that the entire Muslim community is violent, so therefore it's okay if we arrest them. And as a consequence, 2,000 Muslims were arrested, and with the support of many of us, none of us questioned this. To date, none of us questioned this. So for instance, if I can think of one case right now, which I can talk about, my friend and colleague Dilshan Mohammed was arrested as a terrorist soon after the Easter Sunday attack. And in fact, he was one of the few people who was, even prior to the Easter Sunday attack, he was warning the government that there were some radical elements forming inside the Muslim community and the government have to take action. But the government didn't do anything about it. But soon after the Easter Sunday happened, they arrested him as a terrorist as well. And to date, he remains as a terrorist suspect. So the reason I speak about this, is that in order to effectively implement the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the idea of who is a terrorist is first created by the government. So the moment the government says, this is the terrorist, Tamils are the terrorists, Muslims are the terrorists, now the students are the terrorists, once they create this idea and they say terrorism is a horrendous offense, through terrorism people die, so we need to protect you all, we also put that in our head, and thereafter anything which happens to these so-called terrorists, we are okay with it. So it's after this ideology is created, then the Prevention of Terrorism Act is set in motion, and all anti-terror legislations, whether it be the PTA, or whether it be the anti-terror legislation in India, or whether it be the Patriot Act in the United States, or any anti-terror legislation, they follow certain basic rules. And that is why it's called anti-terror legislation. The first rule is that when you arrest a terrorist, that terrorist does not need any protection from courts. So most often than not, judicial protection is removed from being given to the terrorist suspect. The second thing they say is that the government needs long periods of time to investigate. So therefore, we need to keep this person under prolonged detention, then only we can investigate and prevent acts of terrorism. And then there are, of course, horrendous acts like the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which also makes confessions legally admissible. So as Vasanta was saying, you put a person behind bars, you don't even have to physically torture him. You put a person behind bars for 1 year, and then after 1 year you come and say, you confess, we will let you out, or you agree to this and we will let you out. And a normal person would confess to anything, because who does not want to get out? And that is how most convictions in terrorism cases are obtained. So why I'm narrating this story is that now there is a lot of hype even within the government circles, because they want to get the GSP, that they want to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So the government is also saying we want to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But the last time the government said we want to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act, they came up with something called the Counter-Terror Act, and several lawyers who have appeared for PTA cases, who know what the PTA is, supported this Counter-Terror Act as more progressive than the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So this time also, the government is going to do that. There's a lot of pressure from, let's say, the European Union to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But the European Union does not say anything about the new counter-terror legislation which the government is going to bring. So the reason I'm saying all of this is when it comes to the fight against terrorism laws, we cannot rely on states. We can't rely on the European Union. We cannot rely on the United States. We are on our own. People are on our own. And we need to recognize for the last 30, 40 years, the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been used against people who have spoken against the government, innocent people, people who have been scapegoated by the government. So this is what is going to happen in the future also. So therefore, I think we have to take a discussion forward. I hope we build a campaign where we say we want to abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act, but we also want a country free of terrorism charges. And of course, then the counter argument is brought in. What happens when an offense like a mass scale violence happened? What happens then? We have penal code offenses under the ordinary law where people can be punished for mass scale violence. And if that is not adequate, an amendment to the penal code can be brought in, but all other protection given to all other suspects ought to be given to the so-called terrorist suspects also. So that is our position. If I may say one last thing about the judgment, the magistrate's judgment, which completely released Vasantha Mudalige. We call it a historical judgment because the PTA has been in existence since 1979. And this is the first time in the history of the PTA, a magistrate has completely discharged a suspect from all charges under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I think the judgment ought to be read by everyone. But it is historical. And it kind of breaks this coldness or this ice which existed. The Supreme Court always said the magistrate has powers to release someone if that person is innocent. But the magistrates have always come under pressure from exercising this right. But this time, the magistrate actually took that power and released Vasantha Mudalige. So I think we need to be really, it's a historical moment. And the final thing which I want to say is, governments argue, not only in Sri Lanka, but all around the world, governments argue that the government needs to be given extraordinary powers to deal with terrorism situations. Governments have to be given large powers to arrest, to detain, to torture, to extract confessions. They need to be given extraordinary powers. And the judiciary, we should always keep the judiciary away because the judiciary is not flexible. Now, I can speak out of my own experience that this is not true. There has been magistrates in Mullaitivu who have opened the courthouses at 12 o'clock to remand a suspect. There has been magistrates in Colombo who have opened up entire courthouses at 7 o'clock to bail out suspects. So the argument that the judiciary is not flexible is a false argument. And that is a way in which the government tries to convince us that government needs to be given extra powers and keep the judiciary out of terrorism cases. So we should always oppose the move by the government to amass more powers to itself and unfairly incarcerate people.